All right, it's thinking about it. All right, we are now recording. Okay, so just to start us off, just a few words about why we are doing this training. As you probably know, if you've been around Oregon at all, we have made great strides in our DNA section, and we have ongoing wonderful work in our latent print section and a bunch of other sections at the laboratory. We have found through some communication with our law enforcement partners that often there's not very much information out there in our smaller agencies and many of our larger agencies as well about what the trace evidence section can offer in terms of your investigative work. And so the first thing is just information sharing with you. I think we think of ourselves in the laboratory as your partner in public service, and we want to offer our skills and our capacities to your investigations so that we're really making full use of the laboratory capacities as we have them in the state. We have multiple different types of trace evidence, but we're going to focus on the ones that Carly and I perform, and there may be future webinars over other topics such as fibers and impressions and that sort of thing. So today we're going to first talk about what we do with glass evidence in the laboratory, to kind of go into a deep dive about the science. It does get a little nerdy, but I know you'll bear with me. We find glass evidence fascinating here, and we hope to share some of that enthusiasm with you. So basically, how do we approach glass evidence? Because I think knowing what we do with the samples in the laboratory can help you know what to target when you're out at the scene and what questions to ask if you're addressing an investigation regarding glass in court. We also want to talk about what do glass lab reports look like once we're finished with our analysis, and what we can say and what we can't say in our testimony if you call us to trial. We'll talk specifically then about what you do at the scene in terms of collection of the glass standards and collection of the glass evidence. And we have some case examples from prior work kind of sprinkled throughout to show you what we mean with real life evidence. We do have, I think, close to 200 people who registered for this event, and we're very excited about that number. We have done some outreach in the past, but more on a local scale here in the metro region. We did travel to Umatilla a couple of years ago, I think, and did a session there. And although we prefer live trainings in person, obviously that's not possible now. And the real silver lining of doing it virtually is we see so many of our counties in the state represented here in this forum, and that's really wonderful for us because we wouldn't have the opportunity to travel and do this in your areas in all likelihood. So because there are so many people, we do have quite a gamut of professions. We have a lot of law enforcement partners here from agencies big and small, everyone from major crime scene team members, criminal investigators, detectives, evidence and property technicians, everything, sergeants, welcome. We also have members of our criminal justice community from multiple district attorneys' offices around the state, and some members from the Portland FBI office as well. So for some of you, this material may be review. I apologize if some of it is repetitious, but I hope there's something in it for everyone that is new and that you can learn something and maybe reinforce things that you had heard in the past, but it wasn't fresh in your mind. All right, I am going to share my PowerPoint. And from now on, except when we're back to the questions, you'll just see my slides rather than my video. All right, Carly tells me it's working. Thank you, Carly. All right, so just a quick overview for those of you who may be a little unclear on what we term trace evidence, and this will vary from state to state, but in Oregon, through our Forensic Services Division, trace evidence encompasses these main topics: arson, fibers analysis, glass, which is of course what we're talking about today, hair evidence, paint, which is next week's webinar. Physical fits, which are also referred to as physical match, which we'll talk about in webinar number 3. And then miscellaneous is our topic for webinar number 4. And miscellaneous is just really a huge catch-all for all the disciplines that don't, or for all the cases that don't neatly fit into one of the other sub-disciplines of trace evidence. So just a reminder, trace evidence categories such as arson and fibers and glass are each a separate training program, and the scientists who do them are doing separate proficiency tests and competency tests, and are really just trained differently to be different experts. So if you have a phone call question to us regarding hair, it's important that you talk to a hair expert, because myself as a glass expert may not give you the most relevant or up-to-date information. So if you call the Portland lab, which is where all trace evidence work is done in the state, we'll make sure to route that question to the correct person so you get the best possible answer. All right, let's dive in. So all of trace evidence, and in fact most forensic work, is based on this principle called the LowCards exchange principle. And Edmond LowCard was a Frenchman who made this famous statement, in French of course, almost 100 years ago. And the idea is that whenever there's contact between two objects, there is always an exchange of material. Now, when we're talking about a crime scene or a vehicle crash, the objects in question could be any combination of people and their clothing, or the vehicles, or really any other objects. And the trace in this specific thinking for Edmond LowCard could be biological materials, or it could be physical materials. And now that forensic work is widespread, made great strides in the last 100 years, we've specialized into experts in specific types of trace materials. And some materials we give special names, specific names like DNA. So DNA would be a trace material that is left behind when contact is made. And so with body fluids or latent prints, things like loose hairs and so forth. So we're going to think of trace materials today as specific physical materials, but in the concept of, hey, things touched and they left some trace between them, it could be biological or physical. We like to think of these two branches of evidence as working hand in hand, and they have both different advantages and different limitations. So for biological materials such as DNA or hair-containing DNA, body fluids, which also could contain DNA, or latent prints, these have great potential to be associated with a particular person. So if you have this type of evidence, as you know, you might get a report where this print was identified to person X, or this DNA sample, or this swab, or this blood, has such and such likelihood of being from this individual. On the other hand, physical materials cannot be associated with a particular person. They are mass-produced materials in most cases, but they have the potential to show support that there was contact during an event. So think of this as kind of the advantage and disadvantage of trace materials such as glass, paint, and fibers. Yes, you can't track it down to a person, so you have some limitations on the who, but you have more information about the when. If you've ever spoken with a latent print examiner or a DNA examiner, they will freely admit that they can't give you any information about when a latent print was deposited or how long DNA has been on a door handle, for example. It's the limitation of the biological evidence. Whereas if we're talking about glass or paint or other trace materials, we often have a glimpse into when that material was transferred, because there isn't an opportunity for broken glass to be shared unless the glass is broken or breaking. So most of the time, glass is not shedding from the windows all around us. Paint is not shedding from the vehicles and the walls around us. So it can pinpoint it more in a period of time around an event in question. All right, there's a lot of words here, but just to kind of summarize each one of these points, we're hoping that you keep in mind the possibilities of trace evidence to assist in your investigations and in your trials for the following reasons. Number one, as I said, it may show physical evidence of contact between objects or individuals, although we do want to remind everybody that if we don't find any physical evidence, it doesn't prove that there was no contact, just that there's no physical evidence of that contact. For example, it doesn't mean that a suspect didn't break a window. It could be that all the broken glass on their clothing has already dropped off before the clothing was collected. And then please also be aware that there is the possibility of secondary transfer. And by that I mean if I sit in a chair and pick up some cat hair, it doesn't necessarily mean that I held the cat. It could mean that the cat sat on the chair and then shed some hairs that were then transferred to me later. So we do want to be careful in some circumstances where secondary transfer is a chance. Number two, it could show two-way transfer. We'll talk about that a lot in next week's webinar about paint. It's also very useful in cases where you don't have biological evidence from the suspect transferred. And in the glass and paint world, we work a lot of cases that involve vehicle fatalities. So that could be vehicle to vehicle. It could also be vehicle to bicyclist, vehicle to pedestrian, and so forth. It's very unlikely that the DNA or the latent prints from the suspect are going to be found at the scene because that driver isn't getting out of their car. They're just leaving the scene. And so we need to make this case or help this investigation be a physical evidence rather than biological evidence. Or number four, there could be biological evidence present, but it doesn't necessarily answer the probative questions. So a good example of this would be there is a breaking and entry crime and a suspect is stopped in his car, and from that car trunk, a pry bar is recovered, and that pry bar appears to have paint similar to the door frame paint that was at the crime scene. So oftentimes that pry bar will be sent in for latent print work, so looking for the biological evidence of the latent prints on the pry bar, but the pry bar was taken from the trunk of the car that the suspect was driving. And so the association of the pry bar with the person isn't necessarily very helpful investigatively. Instead, the trace evidence of looking at the paint evidence would be more probative to show that the pry bar itself was associated with the crime, and it's not just some random pry bar which anyone is allowed to carry around with them. So the order of the work that we do in the lab is important so that we are making sure we answer the questions that really are relevant in the case by doing that type of analysis first. Number five, we'll talk about some specific examples of this today and in other webinars. The trace findings may make the DNA sample of associated evidence in a case CODIS eligible for searching. So as you know, in order to search the CODIS database for suspect DNA hits, the DNA section must conform to very rigorous eligibility standards. And so you can't just search anything. Well, if we can make a link between the evidence with a trace investigation or a trace finding, that may meet those eligibility requirements. And now the DNA in the case can be searched. Number six, we may be able to provide investigative information about unknown vehicles. We will talk a lot about that in the coming weeks. Number seven, oftentimes we can help to corroborate or refute statements looking at the physical evidence. We've had multiple cases where the alibi of a person of interest is that they weren't in the car, they had loaned their car to someone else when it was in some kind of incident, and finding glass from the car on their clothing is a finding that would refute that statement, because just driving the car in a normal circumstance isn't going to shed windshield glass onto their clothing. That windshield glass would only be able to be transferred during the breakage or after the fact. We'll talk specifically about the types of trace analysis as we go along. We can classify, identify, and compare. And most of the things we're talking about today with glass involve comparison. We do work property crimes. We work everything from criminal mischief to multiple homicide, death investigations. So we prefer actually that if there's relevant trace evidence that you go ahead and send it in, regardless of the level of the crime. Of course, we will have to triage cases based on resources here. So we're going to be working your person crimes first. However, the way we build expertise as trace evidence experts is by working all sorts of evidence. The more we can get and the more experience we can build, the better we can serve you in your crime investigations. So please don't neglect to send something in just because you think it's not important enough for us to work. All right, so I said most of the things we're going to talk about with glass involve comparison, so let's start from the beginning. So this would apply to glass, but also to paint and fibers. Most of the analysis that we are doing in the laboratory involves comparison of a known sample. So this is a sample you know where it came from. That's the standard that you collect, with a question sample or multiple question samples. So just in this photograph here, imagine you go to a scene and there's a large patio door broken through. You know that the glass below that broken pane came from that window. That's a safe assumption. So you would collect a standard from this sample to be your known window glass. And in fact, looking at this photograph, you can tell this is a double paned window, which does probably add some complications that we would need to discuss with you, but this is going to be your known. Then if a suspect is located, there could be question fragments of glass on that person's clothing or in their hair, on their shoes. And so those are the samples of glass that we have questions about. We don't know where they came from. And the question is, did they come from this broken window? Now, sometimes you don't find the clothing with the person still in them. For example, if you found several blocks away just the stocking cap and you thought, ooh, I think I might see some glass on there, I'm going to send that in and see. What we can do is ask the question, did the glass on the stocking cap come from that window, that broken window at the scene? If they are associated, meaning we can't tell any difference between those fragments on the stocking cap and the window itself, now we've associated the stocking cap itself with a potential crime, and now that cap itself is CODIS eligible for DNA searching, and so we could collect DNA evidence from it. So whether or not you have a suspect, think about what questioned items you may have to compare to that known window. In a scenario like the previous one, you'll probably be at the crime scene and see the known glass first. So your opportunity here first is to collect the glass standard for comparison. Now at this point, you may not know if you'll ever have anything to compare to that glass standard. You don't know if you'll locate a suspect. You don't know if you'll find a trail of broken glass that leads you to anybody of interest. But we would like to encourage you to just kind of think ahead and kind of hedge your bets. Like if you don't collect that glass standard now, you may lose the opportunity. That scene is going to be cleaned up, the broken glass will be discarded, and you may lose your chance to collect it later if you don't grab that chance now. We see this as the most common missed opportunity. People down the road will find questioned glass, but because they failed to collect a standard at the time, we're really not able to help out much from the lab point of view. So if you go to a scene and there is broken glass, we encourage you to always collect a glass standard for comparison. It's not a biohazard in most cases. You can just store it in your property room if it ever is needed later. In other situations, you may run across what is the questioned glass first, and you won't have the standard yet. And a hit and run fatality is the most, well, maybe not the most common example, but a common example of what we're talking about there. If you find the victim's body, there may be broken glass nearby the point of impact. There may be broken glass on the victim, on their clothing, in their hair, depending on if they impacted the windshield or perhaps a side mirror. So think about collecting that broken glass at the scene, perhaps from their clothing, or perhaps just sending in the clothes for us to screen to see if broken glass is present. In this situation, you don't have a standard yet, and only with that standard from later collection will a comparison be possible. However, if you do have a question sample, we can certainly look at it to see whether it is possibly tempered glass from a side window, mirrored glass. Maybe it's not vehicle glass at all and it really isn't probative in the case. So we can perhaps give you some information that can help guide your searching for a suspect vehicle. So in other words, in both these situations, think about what evidence you have now, whether it's an opportunity to collect a standard or whether it's the questioned glass, and then what you might find later, which would make that useful. So as you clearly know, lots of crimes involve broken glass. That broken glass has an opportunity during the breakage of flying large distances. There's a great picture on a later slide, and we'll talk about that phenomenon a little bit more. But breaking glass fragments can be trapped and retained. Also, if someone walks over broken glass, it's likely that their shoes may pick up some, and they can transfer it from one place to another. However, particles of broken glass don't stay forever on a person's clothing or in their hair. During normal activity, they will be lost quickly, so time is of the essence. On the other hand, they may be lost to a place that you can later gather and collect them. So for example, if someone breaks some glass, whether it's an assailant with a broken bottle or a burglar breaks a window, they may collect glass particles on the clothing, which then drop into the driver's car seat as they get in the car to drive away. So even though those pieces of glass may no longer be on their clothing, you may be able to vacuum the car seat and collect that evidence from that location. Or if they had glass in their shoe tread, or it was kind of being tracked into another location, possibly even into their home, their doormat, the car mat where they're putting their feet, those are great places to look for transferred glass evidence. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So when you are thinking about glass evidence, these are just some typical types of crimes that we see these cases associated with. Definitely any hit and run vehicle incidents, broken windshields, windows, mirrors, any point of entry involving broken glass, arsons with broken windows, arsons also with Molotov cocktails using glass containers, shootings through vehicle or building windows. That is a very common way to break glass, and the glass breaks catastrophically, so it is very likely to be transferred far distances. Assaults using broken bottles, and then questions regarding who was driving or was someone in a vehicle when it was being driven at a certain time. The other point I didn't add to this slide, but it's becoming increasingly a possibility for glass evidence, is smartphone or PED, personal electronic device glass, whether that's laptops or smartphones. Obviously, we're all carrying these bits of glass around in our pockets and purses all the time, and they are quite often broken in violent events. So consider that as well. One of the questions we hear in the laboratory is, well, what can you say about glass? Isn't all glass the same? And of course, if only we could explain. So here we're going to dive into the science a little bit, just some background material about what is glass. So when glass is manufactured, it is mostly melted sand, but then they will mix together the sand with other ingredients to create products that have certain characteristics. So they may want amber brown colored glass. They may want green glass. They may want the glass to be completely colorless. They may want it to form in a mold well, or they want it to form a flat pane without any bubbles. So all the ingredients are mixed together specifically to achieve the final characteristics of the product that they're making. And even though most of the glass is sand, remember that sand is not just one thing. So sand is mined or dug from wherever is probably the closest local source, because sand is very heavy and expensive to ship large distances. And because the parts of the Earth's crust vary in mineral content over its total expanse, the sand mined in one location will be different than the sand mined in a different location. So if we have a glass plant in Chicago and a glass plant in San Diego, they will be using sand from different sources, and that will result in glass that contains different trace minerals. So it's pretty cool to think about. Now, of course, a lot of products are shipped all over the world, so we will have a mix of these glasses in our local location, but the fact that they're made in different locations then gives us a wide variety of these characteristics to measure when we see glass samples. So in addition, modern glass often contains recycled content. This is more prevalent with container glass, such as bottles and jars, than it is with window glass. But in both cases, it is helpful to us because by mixing recycled glass with the other ingredients, it increases the variation that we see in the population of glass. So there's more different combinations of the characteristics that we measure. There is a big glass recycling plant in downtown Portland, kind of in the industrial area off Interstate 30. And they will sort glass by color, and it's done using an amazingly huge conveyor belt and lasers and cameras and puffs of air to direct the glass into the right colored pile, but it's not 100% efficient. So the green glass pile will have bits of clear glass and blue glass and even brown glass, and that all will get melted together the next time they need green glass for their glass batch. And so you'll see little bits of variation over time from the recycled content. So when we talk about how much difference there is in the glass around us, we know that there is a large amount of difference. If I picked up two pieces just randomly going for a mile walk, there's far more likelihood that they're going to have different properties than share all their properties. However, we want to be really clear that glass is a mass-produced material, so we can never make a one-to-one link between a questioned fragment of glass, I'm just calling that a Q here, and a known standard of glass, a K. So that one-to-one link is not possible with glass. However, as we'll see in the next couple slides, the measurements that we make are very discriminating and highly sensitive. So most of the glass that we do see in casework is either vehicle windshield glass, or it is architectural glass, building windows, building door panels, things like that. However, we also recognize that there are a number of different categories of glass that are quite different. And having these types of glasses in a case would be very significant because they're just more rare than those more common types of glass. So some examples here that you see are the PED glass that we just spoke about, eyeglasses with glass optical lenses. You still do have some older vehicles with headlight glass, although most headlight assemblies are now comprised of plastic parts. The light bulb glass that we see both in vehicles and household lights is a very specialized type of glass, as is scientific glassware such as beakers, or then anything in the decorative art category or functional glass categories such as glass cooktops or fireplace glass doors that are very thermally resistant. So all of these would look very different to us in the lab with the tests that we do from your typical window from a car, window from a building type glass. So what we're doing in the laboratory when we approach a glass case is we ask ourselves two questions as we work. Can I detect any difference between that Q glass and the known glass samples? In other words, could the question glass have come from the known glass source item? So we know that small fragments of broken glass, especially glass that is meant to be clear, colorless glass, it looks the same to the naked eye. We recognize that, but we are using very sensitive instrumentation in order to measure qualities about the glass. We measure its elemental profile and the optical properties of the glass. And with these two measurements, we can tell the difference between many, many, many samples of glass. So if we tell the difference, if we can detect a difference in our first steps, then the analysis is complete. We have answered the question, no, the question fragment could not have come from the known glass source, and we stop work. If we can't tell the difference with step number 1, then we will continue to step number 2 and 3 and so forth until we have exhausted all of our tests that we can do in the laboratory. And it's at that point that we decide, all right, with all the tests that I have at my disposal, I can't tell the difference between these samples. Therefore, they could have come from the known glass. So some glass cases begin with the screening of the evidence. Not all cases, but I'm sure this will sound familiar to you. Sometimes we receive debris from vacuum sweeping from a car, or we've even received cases where we get the entire car mat that's just kind of rolled up and put into a box. We're looking through that debris for what we call fresh fragments of glass, or we may be doing the same type of screening for the clothing of a hit and run garment, hit and run victim, excuse me, or for garments taken from a person of interest to look for question glass. Let's talk a little bit about this word fresh in the context of glass analysis. So I want to emphasize that what we mean by fresh is that we can see under the microscope that this glass is very sharp. Its edges appear to have little or no wear to them after they have been broken. We look for fresh fragments in order to distinguish possible probative glass that is of use in an investigation, from environmental glass that's just been around a while. Because glass in the environment, through weathering and friction and just abrasion and wear, it does lose these sharp edges very quickly, especially tiny, tiny fragments. We are not implying with the word fresh that it means that it was recent in time, because we can't do that, because this little fresh fragment could have fallen into a protected pocket into a vehicle, maybe kind of fallen into the little storage area in your driver's door. If it falls in there and it's not exposed to the elements and nothing is rubbing against it and it just stays there for years, when we look at it years later, it may still look fresh. So we can't talk about the elapse of time, but we can say that the particle has not been worn since it was broken. And in most situations, we're screening debris or garments and looking for this fresh glass shortly after the event in question, because it's part of an ongoing investigation. So after we have screened the evidence and we have found question glass, We are comparing that question glass with the glass standard that the agency has provided to us that came from a known broken source of glass. We start with a Q to K comparison of kind of the macroscopic or larger features of the glass. And we can only do this if size allows of the particles. Sometimes the particles of question glass are too small to even do this step, and we have to skip over it. But given large enough particles, we will compare the colors, the thicknesses, and the manufacturing characteristics of the Q and the K to see if they are consistent with one another. And by manufacturing characteristics, what we're talking about is this mirrored glass? Is it tempered glass? So, vehicle side windows and rear windows and sunroofs and things like that, those are all tempered safety glass. It's a very different type of glass than, say, a windshield, which is not tempered glass, but instead is sandwiched laminated glass. We might also look for, is the glass flat from like a flat pane, or is it curved, meaning it could be from a bottle or a container? And we'll look for other things like, does it have any mold marks? How was it manufactured? If it is flat glass, we'll do a certain test. So that's just sort of where we start. Our next step involves our first instrument, which is the X-ray fluorescence spectrophotometer, the XRF for short. And with this instrument, which is also used in paint analysis, we are able to measure the elements that the glass is made up of. So we get kind of a profile of the elemental characteristics of the glass sample. Again, if we do our Q to K comparison and they are clearly different, we are finished. We are done. The glass Q sample could not have come from the K standard. If we can't tell any difference, then we will move on to our second instrument, where we measure the refractive index of the glass, which is a property of how the glass bends light. Just like if you have a pool of water, you know that if you're looking at yourself standing in the water up to your waist, the way your legs look is somewhat foreshortened because the light has bent as it is going through the interface of the air to the water. Same thing with glass. So we'll measure the property of how much that light is bent. And we use an instrument called the GRIM for that, which is it's short for the Glass Refractive Index Measurement System. I think there's a slide later with a photo of that. These procedures that we use are based on ASTM standardized methods, which means that they have been accepted through a consensus model as appropriate and proper techniques for these types of analysis. And the ASTM adoption process involves members of the scientific community, but also members of the legal community. It's open for public comment, statisticians, and that sort of thing. So these are quite rigorous standards that we use for glass. And again, the two questions I'm kind of thinking as I'm working all these days on this case are, can I detect any difference between the Q and the K glass samples? In other words, could the question fragment have come from the known glass source? So let's look at just a quick couple slides of what does the XRF data look like. So when I say I'm looking at the elemental profile, what am I actually looking at? So this is a zoomed in screenshot of 3 samples of glass, and you can see they're in different colors. So we have a red sample, a green sample, and a blue sample. And the labels in black at the peaks are the different elements. So we have Na for sodium on the left, magnesium next, aluminum. The Ka is just something about quantum mechanics that isn't important today. But basically, we get a readout of what elements are in the glass. In this example, I have zoomed in. So the 2 peaks that are so tall, they're going kind of off the chart, are the silicon, which comes from silicon dioxide, which is that sand we talked about, and then calcium, which is usually the second largest peak in normal window glass. But what we're really more interested in are some of these trace or lower level elements. And we can see that in our 3 samples here, we have 2 that overlap pretty well, but that red sample is different than the other 2. So I see there's differences with the aluminum level. It's higher in the red, lower in the other 2. Same for potassium, K, it's higher in the red. And then for manganese, Mn, the level in the red sample is lower than the other 2. So these would be differences detected by the XRF that would differentiate the Q sample red from the other 2. Let's say the other 2 are the standards. So they could not share a common source. Once we eliminated the red, now I want to take a closer look at the green and the blue. So the first step we do with the XRF is kind of this visual look at the data that we receive. And we make that judgment, okay, some of these are obviously different. But if the lines overlap pretty closely, then we will proceed to do further analysis using the XRF, where we measure each sample multiple times and then do some statistical calculations to do the comparison so that it's less subjective, just me or Carly looking at the data. We've actually calculated some standard deviations and some means and so forth to follow the standardized method for when we can say these 2 are different statistically or these 2 are the same statistically. Here's that photo of the GRIM system. You can see it's a microscope kind of hooked to a computer, and we're measuring the optical qualities of our glasses. And again, this is a statistical method where we measure our known glass 30 times or sometimes more, but usually 30 is the minimum. And we use those 30 measurements to establish the range for the known glass. Why is there a range? So imagine that we have a windshield or a broken Jack Daniel's whiskey bottle. The way those glass pieces are manufactured is obviously the glass at one time is liquid and then it is cooled to room temperature and it solidifies as it cools. The cooling rate of the glass will have an effect on the refractive index of the cooled finished glass. So if I have a Jack Daniel's bottle, the base of that bottle is thicker, it's thicker glass, than say areas of the neck or the body of the glass. Because it's thicker, it's going to cool probably more slowly or at a different rate than other parts of that same bottle. So I will get slightly different refractive index from the base of that bottle compared to the neck of that bottle. So what I need to do is make enough measurements of different parts of the bottle that I understand what is the whole range of this characteristic for that broken item. And same thing for a windshield. It's going to cool at different rates, different parts of it, and we need to be able to assess that. So for the GRIM work, we'll do those 30 measurements for our known. And then for each question, we will compare it to that range that we established for the known. As I said, most glass that we see in casework is either window glass or sometimes we see container glass. And the GRIM will measure the refractive index value out to 5 decimal places. And commonly the glasses we see fall between 1.50000 and 1.53000. So that's a total of 3,000 different possible values. So if you can just imagine you're picking up 2 random pieces of glass as you go for a walk, they could fall anywhere in those 3,000 different possible values. So the likelihood that they would coincidentally fall close enough that we would call them statistically the same is a low possibility. So when we receive glass evidence in the laboratory, we do have some limitations as far as sample size. We will go over how to collect glass standards in a different part of this presentation. But we're talking here about how big do the particles need to be of questioned glass. So if I'm screening a victim's clothing for glass or a suspect's clothing for glass, how big do the particles of glass have to be before we can actually work with them in the laboratory? So the answer is really small. We can conduct our full analysis anywhere down to 1 millimeter in glass fragment size. So for those of you who prefer the inch system, that's about 1/25 of an inch. These fragments may not even be noticed by the naked eye, depending on the context. If it's a dark evening scene or the clothing is a loose weave and the glass particles have kind of worked their way into the fibers, the glass might not even be seen. So please don't assume that there is no glass there. We will do our due diligence in the laboratory to collect any debris on the clothing and then screen it under the microscope so we don't miss anything that is probative that may be there. We also can do some analysis on particles that are even smaller. However, we kind of put this 1 millimeter threshold because that's where we can do all the statistics that we talked about. Glass fragments may also have other evidence on them. We do see broken glass fragments that have blood, sometimes victim blood, but it could be suspect blood depending on the scenario. Latent prints. Sharp glass edges will be great for trapping fibers and pulling them out of clothing or upholstery, carpets. And we have seen a small number of cases where we see transfer of bullet material on glass if the pane is broken by a bullet shot. If appropriate, you will be contacted regarding the analysis of other evidence types that may be present. So if we have assessed the scenario, given the reports we received from you, and we think, oh, you know what, I think this blood, this might be from not the victim, it might be from somebody else. So let's figure out if that needs to go for testing. We will reach out to you before we proceed. Vehicle glass itself may also have frit, tinting, or other surface applications that can also be compared, such as if it's a rear window, it may have those defrosting filaments on the glass. That is another thing that we can compare Q to K. And any association that we make using multiple compared features, will strengthen the association. So the more things we compare and we still can't tell any difference, the stronger that association will be. And then it is very rare, but larger pieces of broken glass may be suitable for a physical match request as well. So just keep that in mind if you encounter that situation at a scene where you have large glass. I will point out physical fit or match requests cannot be made on tempered glass because, as you know, tempered glass breaks catastrophically as soon as its surface is breached. So it just devolves instantaneously almost into hundreds of tiny little pieces. So we're not going to fit that back together and be able to say anything conclusive. Oh, somehow I'm missing a picture on this slide. Oh yeah, there it is. All right, so I mentioned frit, and this is just a little bonus that we can do with glass. This is the black ceramic that is on window edges, and it's another thing that we can compare if we see it in both our Q and our K samples. So this is just a quick photo of some of the particle sizes that we see, just to kind of give you an image. The largest particle here on the left is 2 millimeters in size, and then the smallest one on the right is 1/10 of 1 millimeter. So the ones that are big enough for analysis are definitely these two on the left, full analysis, and then we would probably do some screening analysis on the smaller ones. And these were retrieved from a suspect's shoes. So what will our glass reports say when we are finished? So if at any time in our analysis we were able to tell the difference between the Q and the K, then we will say that the known source cannot be the source of the question fragments, and that is called an exclusion. If we cannot differentiate the Q and the K, then we will say that the known item or another broken glass item with all the same properties could be the source of the question glass fragment, and this is an association. An association means, for us scientifically, that the elemental profiles of the Q and the K glass samples, as well as their optical properties and any other features, are indistinguishable from one another. So all of our tests couldn't tell any difference between these samples. Glass reports will also include some of the specific details about what evidence we collected, what we saw. It will list our instrumentation. You may see an expert opinion about the significance of the findings, and we'll also list on the report if there was some issue that caused problems with the standard, or if the question fragments were too small to be fully compared. The limitations of glass analysis are very simple. As we've said before, because glass is mass-produced, we can never make a link that is a one-to-one between a question and a known source to the exclusion of all others. We cannot provide statistics or odds. You won't see probabilities on our reports. And that's because there are just too many unknowns about the worldwide population of glass objects, and it's constantly changing. However, we do use instruments that are very sensitive and can detect elements down to parts per million. And as I said, the refractive index is measured out to the 5th decimal place. These are very sensitive methods. They are recommended methods for glass comparison. However, we can only make the measurements that our instruments allow, and another instrument with greater sensitivity could detect differences that we could not. We're not going to go through all this language, but you will see changes over time. We are considering for glass and paint and fibers, adding an association scale to our reports. You may have seen these with impressions reports in the past. So instead of just saying this glass could have come from this broken window, we are moving toward giving you a little bit more detail about whether it is strong support, whether it's extremely strong support, or just slight support. And so look for that in the future, but that language is still evolving. A question we receive sometimes from the legal community is, well, what about all the random glass around us in the environment? That's a great question. However, there have been multiple studies over the decades to show that the average person just doesn't have a lot of broken glass on them. There are some exceptions, like the bottom of their shoes and people who work with glass as a profession, but your average person is not covered in broken glass. So finding it on someone's garments is significant. We talked already about the difference between fresh looking glass and worn looking glass, and that helps us target our analysis to just fresh glass in a scenario. And then if someone does have environmental glass on them, for example, if they were in contact with the surface of a road, that group of glass found on their garments is going to be quite a variety. It's going to be a population that has different broken windows represented. So it's more likely that if we found a population of question glass that all shared the same characteristics, that would be related to a given event. Random glass is going to just have a mixture of glass. All right, I'm going to. Okay.
About like how the standard and
okay, sounds good. I'm hearing from Carly that the questions she's received are going to be covered in the next section of slides. So I'm just going to keep going. Maybe. Uh-oh. Okay. All right, so let's look at some examples. So this is one from several years ago where we had a Macy's store, and It was broken into by shattering a glass door, and then the iPod vending machine in the store, which was also made out of glass, was broken to steal the merchandise. A local police officer noted that there was a pile of clothing items and bloody gloves located at a nearby apartment complex. Had no reason to necessarily, associate that with this Macy's crime. However, he noticed that it looked like there could be some glass on the clothing. So he went back to the Macy's store and collected standards of the broken glass there. This was the same day. We worked on the glass in the lab, and analysis showed that 2 of the 3 fragments from the clothing were associated with the entry door, and this was an unusually thick type of glass, kind of rare glass. And then the 3rd of the 3 fragments was associated with the vending machine glass. So now we have associated the clothing with the glass breaking event. So that means the blood on the gloves can be tested for DNA and be searched in CODIS. In this example, the database did not include that DNA. So it's just searched on a regular basis to see if it ever comes up with a hit. And prints were also collected at the scene, but they had insufficient detail for searching in ABIS. So it's kind of an ongoing mystery, but the glass work did assist in getting into CODIS eligibility. Here's a kind of a converse example of a missed opportunity. We have a building with lots of broken windows, and the suspect's shoes were submitted and glass was found on them. However, the agency submitted a glass standard for only 1 of the 21 windows, and none of the glass on the shoes were associated with that 1 glass standard. So who knows? If it could have come from others of the 21 windows, we will never know. That is a lot of standards to collect and compare, but submitting 1, I think, is kind of a false assumption that all those windows in the building are the same, and they're definitely not. Actually, I'm going to skip classification for now. We can come back to it if we have any time at the end. All right, so collection of your standard and collection of your evidence, how to package it, how to submit it, what does the lab need from you? So as I mentioned before, in some scenarios, you will come across the standard first, so collect what you see now, even if you don't know if you'll have anything for us to compare it to later on. Or scenario 2, collect the question glass while you have it there, hoping that you are able to locate a comparison standard later on. So how do you collect a glass standard? What we need from you for the lab is a separate glass standard for each broken item at the scene or in question. So if you have a vehicle with 3 broken windows, we'll need a standard from each of those 3. So 3 separately packaged standards that come from the 3 broken windows. We would recommend, if possible, that you collect window standards from the glass remaining in the frame, not on the ground. And we need double paned glass to be treated as separate standards and labeled with an inner pane versus an outer pane. We'll talk more about windshields separately in a moment. Even if broken windows have been replaced or the mess has been cleaned up, sometimes you can still find glass fragments in the vehicle or in the building. We can use these for comparison standards, but they are not ideal. And typically the fragments that you're collecting for glass standards can just be collected with your gloved fingers because they're plenty big for that. As I said earlier, something like a bottle, we want to take measurements from the whole object. So for smaller items that can be packaged, collect as much as you possibly can and submit it all as standard. For things like tempered or safety glass, such as vehicle windows or building windows, we ask for between 20 and 50 fragments for each standard. And we ask that you try to collect those from different regions of the glass remaining in the frame. So you can see this is just an example. Here's a broken vehicle window, and you want to collect a little bit from all these spots and put that together to be your glass standard for that broken window. If there's no glass still in the frame and you want to collect it from the road or from inside the car, that's That's the reality that sometimes has to happen. Please try to avoid mixing in just road glass that happens to already be there, or combining glass from different windows. So if you had multiple windows in this vehicle, try to collect from inside where it hasn't mixed with the next broken window if possible. And if you do think you have a mixture, if you alert us, that will help us make sure that we're doing some extra screening steps to make sure we don't get confused. For a windshield standard, we need a little specialized action on your part. As you probably know, a windshield is 2 panes of glass sandwiching a plastic layer for safety purposes. And the glass in those 2 panes could be pretty similar to each other, or they could be different from each other. So what we recommend is if you have just damage to the window in one region, collect a standard just from that one region by cutting out a 2-inch by 2-inch square using a Dremel or garden shears. Put your safety goggles on because it'll make a mess and glass will come flying at your face. And then take a Sharpie or some way to label and label an O for the outside of the surface and an I for the inner surface, the in the vehicle surface. On the other hand, if the vehicle windshield is damaged throughout, we ask for 2 standards from separate areas. One cut 2 by 2 again from the center of the windshield, and then 1 2 by 2 square somewhere from the perimeter of the windshield. Again, label those with the I and the O, and you can put those together in one envelope because that is your vehicle standard. And just a reminder, cracked windshields are great collectors of other types of evidence, fibers, blood, tissue, hair. So close examination might reveal other types of evidence that you should collect first before you go to cutting the windshield. All right, that's just a little photo of a training we did where someone is practicing cutting the squares out of the windshield. So that's a collection of standards. The standards are the easy part. So how do you collect the glass evidence, the question parts? Carly, are there other questions you should address? No. Okay. All right, I'm gonna keep going. So, oh, sorry, packaging. I skipped this slide. Let me just really quickly. When you're packaging the glass standard, you want to make sure that that glass, those sharp edges of the glass, don't cut through the packaging and be lost or be a safety hazard for anybody else. So we do recommend you use a plastic or metal canister to put those shards in. Plastic sharps tubes work really well, but please do that first and then put them in a larger container like an envelope or a plastic bag. Please do avoid glass containers for glass evidence, just on the off chance that it gets crushed. And now we're trying to sort a mess of what was the container and what was the sample. And then always include evidence details. Where did you collect this glass from? What object, broken glass object, is it representing? So this is one of my favorite glass photos because I think it just shows how as glass is broken, some of the glass travels in the direction of the swing or the direction of the impact and that force, but you see how much is going backwards, backscattering toward the breaker. And the amount of glass that goes backwards toward the breaker, of course, is going to depend on the force involved, the speed of the breakage, and the type of glass, and all sorts of other factors. And the amount of glass that sticks to the breaker is going to depend on how close they were, what was the height of the breakage compared to the height of the person, what kind of fabrics are they wearing, is it raining, is it dry, all these sorts of things. But as that glass falls, it can be retained in a car, on a carpet, even in someone's pockets, or between the laces of their shoes, on the treads of their shoes. And that's what we want to look for in collecting the evidence glass, the question glass, to compare with our standards. So what we ask from you is if it is garments that need to be screened or footwear, collect and package those as soon as possible to avoid loss of any trace evidence. Because they may have biological evidence on them as well, go ahead and package them in paper. But those paper bags have gapes in the seams sometimes, so please make sure to seal those, because even though the pants can't fall through the gap, the trace glass fragments can definitely fall through those gaps. So you want to make sure to seal them tightly. If you are collecting small particles that you can visibly see, then use your gloved fingers or tweezers. We do ask for gloves because we don't want your transfer of DNA on any of this evidence, just in case there is forwarding of any biological evidence on this sample further in the laboratory. We don't want to pick you up on that evidence. And put these small particles on a Post-it note and then over package them in an envelope or a bag. We also really recommend the use of trace evidence vacuums for larger areas such as vehicle floor mats or carpets. And then if you have hair from a suspect that you think may still contain glass fragments, just take a clean comb and comb that over some clean butcher paper and fold it into a paper fold for us. So what is the trace evidence vacuum? These really, it's not the vacuum itself, it's the filter that is the important part. It really can be used with any vacuum where you can have a hose attachment. And so the filter collects the trace evidence, it stops it from going into the vacuum itself, and it's collected in this sealed environment that is then submitted to us in the laboratory. So here's an example of what it looks like. That red cap comes off the top and that attaches to the vacuum hose. The seal is left intact. The black cap comes off the bottom end. That's used to, vacuum the driver's seat, maybe the driver's floor mat a little bit. The particles go into the sealed middle section, and then both caps get put back on before it is packaged up and sent to us. When we open it up, we see this trace debris. We'll look at it under the microscope and screen for fresh glass material or whatever else we're looking for. If this was used for paint or whatever, sometimes if there's a recovered body, vacuum sweepings come in and they don't even know what we're looking for yet. We're just trying to answer the question, what kind of evidence is on this body that might potentially be probative? It could be glitter, it could be building materials and so forth. So we'll look under the microscope. We'll also look under the microscope for debris from clothing. And in this scenario, this example, after I finished screening all that debris, 2 particles of fresh glass were located, each of them over 1 millimeter in size. So they were suitable for full analysis to the standard. So some of this is a repeat of how to package standards, but the same premise goes for glass evidence. If you have larger pieces, use a canister that's metal or a plastic sharps tube. Physical fit evidence should be taped inside a box to prevent further breakage. Always include those details of where the glass came from so that we have the context for the case. And then we don't really recommend adhesive lifts for glass collection because glass just doesn't stick very well to it, and it's really easy to lose that glass that you're targeting, that you're aiming for. But the exception is Post-it note adhesive is just fine. We love that. It's strong enough to keep the glass once you fold over that note, and yet temporary enough that we can get it off. So here's just an example.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate you guys reaching out.
Oh, Devin, we can hear you talking. Can you mute yourself, please?
Mm-hmm.
So we really love Post-it notes. Here's just a photo of how we recommend that you use them. If you've got your little glass fragments that you collected here with your fingers or your tweezers, or you used it to kind of lift them off a surface with the adhesive, give a circle there so we can know we're seeing what you're seeing, and then fold that over so the adhesive kind of seals it in, and then put your item number or description here so that we can distinguish it from other evidence in the case. And then that would go inside of a secondary package. So we always recommend for trace evidence, use a 2-layer system where you have an inner layer that contains the tiny little parts and particles, and then an outer layer that has all the case info, the barcodes, and just the extra layer of seal to keep everything safe. We do sometimes receive really poorly packaged trace evidence. You can see this gaping hole here. And depending on what the request is, that sometimes means that we just reject it because there's just too many chances for contamination both in and loss out. If you haven't ever practiced paper fold, here's a little cheat sheet. You can find this easily on the internet, but we love paper folds as well, but we do ask that you don't tape them closed. If you do a paper fold correctly, should not need any tape to hold it closed. So just make that your inner layer and put it in an outer layer, and we're good to go. Just wanted to have this slide just for reference. We send our own crime scene teams out with a trace collection kit that has all these various tools and packaging options. And if you want to think about supplying your own folks with something like that, it can just be in a sealed bag and live in the vehicle to be there available if needed, because you just never know when you might have trace evidence to collect. There is a live link newsletter page. Oh, thank you, Carly. Carly is putting the link in the comments. So that newsletter kind of describes the trace evidence kit concept and then gives you some links to suppliers. And a lot of these supplies are just from Amazon or Office Depot or common suppliers. They're not really scientific supply companies, with the exception of these trace lifts here that we make ourselves in the laboratory. So how long does glass analysis take? Well, we're doing pretty well with the turnaround time. We're under 90 days once the glass evidence gets to us in Portland. However, some things that can slow us down is if there's a problem with the standard, or if the report that we get isn't detailed enough to give us the context of what we're trying to answer. What is the question we're trying to answer in this case? So if we get no report, or a report that tells lots of details about what the neighbor said and what the the other person saw, but doesn't really mention the glass, then that slows us down because we have to reach out to you for more info. But a given glass case is really variable. It can take anywhere between 8 and 80 hours for us to work it. Once we get to court, and I will say that we do not testify in glass cases very often at all, but we're happy to testify in them. We can explain our analytical procedures and why they are accepted in our field, and that goes back to that ASTM method kind of idea. We will explain our findings in the case and the meanings as well as the limitations of those findings. If appropriate, we may offer expert opinions about the significance of those findings, and that may be, this is a very common type of glass, so it's perhaps lower significance than other cases, versus this glass is rare in this way, and so that would increase our feelings of the significance of the findings. And then just in general, we can talk about our lab's accreditation status and our QA protocols. So kind of wrapping up with another case example. This one happened, I think this was 5 or 6 years ago now. The scenario is that we had a teenage couple on a date in the male's vehicle. The vehicle then somehow crashes into a tree and the female deceased. The male says she was driving, she did not have a license, by the way. She was driving, he was watching her from afar, and he did not enter the vehicle. Due to the scenario, it being his car, DNA and latent prints are really not probative, because even if they're found in the car, that would be totally expected for one's own car. So what we received were the male's clothing items. And then we also received the windshield standard, both panes, as well as standards from the front and rear passenger windows and the vehicle's rear windows. So there were a total of 4 broken windows on the vehicle. So it's quite a high impact crash into the tree. So the vehicle's windshield and then 3 other windows, we got standards from each. On the suspect's clothing items, we found 4 particles of glass on the shirt and 3 particles found in the front jeans pocket, so inside the pocket. And then those fragments were associated with both the windshield and the side windows, both of those 2 broken side windows. So 7 total particles associated with 3 of the broken window standards. That report went back out, and it never went to trial because the male person of interest decided to change his story and admit that he was in the vehicle when it crashed and he took a plea. So just a few last reminders before we wrap up and see if there's any more questions. With physical evidence such as glass, we are not going to be able to individualize a source to the exclusion of all others, but we can establish a physical link between a person or object in question and an event that was violent enough to cause breakage of glass. And in the cases that we work in glass and paint, in many of those situations, biological evidence is either not transferred or it's not probative. So think of that physical evidence as the second side of what your lab can do for you. But we can only work evidence that, or our results are only as good as the evidence that you collect at the scene. So we do ask that you think about collecting those standards, even if you don't know they will be used later, and collect question glass, even if you don't have a standard yet to compare it to. And then finally, think about kind of multi-layer trace evidence analysis and how it could assist you in your investigation. How would it look for a jury if you had an association on multiple levels? So maybe you don't have a DNA hit, but you have an association between glass and the suspect, between the crime scene and the suspect, as well as paint, and maybe there's also some fibers. The chance that you're going to have multiple levels of trace associations becomes less and less coincidental when you have multiple types of trace evidence working in conjunction. And if you do have any questions, we are more than happy to answer those. You have some phone numbers and emails here. Both myself, I'm the technical leader for glass, paint, miscellaneous, and arson. My colleague Celeste Grover is technical leader for fibers and hairs. And then our supervisor, Devin Summer, is also listed there. We also have the online physical evidence manual. It is a little bit out of date, but it does have a lot of helpful information about collecting evidence, glass, paint, fibers, all of those topics. And we're always willing to answer those questions by email as well. All right, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing. All right, hopefully you can see me instead of the slides now. We have, good point. Did that work? Okay, so we have a little less than 10 minutes. Are there any questions? I'm gonna look at the chat now. Carly may let me know. Sure, let me mention a couple of those housekeeping details again. And then I see someone is asking for the link to the physical evidence manual. And Carly's bringing that into the chat. We are recording these. We're going to put them on YouTube once all 4 are recorded and saved and we figure out the logistics of that. So we'll definitely be in touch via email when those are available. I also think I'm going to send out just a quick survey after this one to ask if there's anything we can do differently or change to see if we can make those suggestions happen before next Thursday's presentation. But look for that. It's optional, obviously. Okay. All right. So it looks like we need last names for an Oscar, Tyler, Keely and Mike J. So if that's you, if you could just type in your full name for our attendance taker. It looks like we've got some of those coming in. All right, so I don't see any subject matter questions coming in at the moment. So just a reminder, next week we're going to be talking about paint. The following week we will discuss a couple things kind of mixed together. We'll do physical match, as well as how we can do make, model, year investigative searches for vehicles using either paint chips or broken vehicle parts that are left at the scene. And then our final one, the 29th of April, also a Thursday, will be on trace miscellaneous. So what does that really mean? And what can the lab do? What can you actually analyze? And what are the limits of that? All right, Carly has posted the link to the physical evidence manual. And it looks like above she posted the link to the newsletter that contains that trace collection kit live link page. So if there's no other questions, I thank you again for your participation. Hoping that you got something out of it, and please let us know via the survey if there's anything we can do differently for the next one. And we'll see you next week. Expect another link from us in your email to the second meeting. Thank you, everybody.